Okay, good evening and welcome everyone on this very cold winter's night. I hope you guys are all snuggled in warm. What a huge Zoom meeting in these crazy COVID times. A special welcome to our wonderful keynote speakers, Mr. Robert Goot, AOSC, and Mr. Dave Sharma, MP. Welcome to past federal presidents, Ronnie Bogner, OAM, Gilla Lieberman, past state presidents, Gloria Newhouse and Esther Wakeman, and all our members, partners and guests who have joined us tonight. Just a little housekeeping. I'm going to ask you now to all turn off your video and we will mute everyone. And this will enable everyone just to see our keynote speakers tonight. If anyone has any questions, they can put them in the chat box. I will then be going through the chat box. We're here in the office tonight and passing it on to our guests who will then endeavour to respond at the end of the interview. So thank you so much. I would like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land that we have gathered on today, and I pay my respects to the elders past, present and emerging. At this very week is WIZO's 100th birthday. We have invited the very talented Amber Langman, a student from Emmanuel School, to sing our national anthems. Amber is the daughter of our long-standing members Lynn Langman and her husband Steve, and is the granddaughter of our wonderful Miriam and Egon Sonnenschein. Amber.
Australians, all let us rejoice, for we are young and free. We've golden soil and wealth, for toil our home is girt by sea. Our land abounds in nature's gifts, our beauty rich and rare. In history's page left every stage and that's Australia fair. In joyful straits then let us sing, advance Australia fair. Color palera penima nefesh Yehudi homiha ulvar der Mizrach kadima.
So beautiful. Thank you so much, Amber. WIZO's mission for 100 years has always been to stay relevant and responsive to the needs of Israeli society and constantly strives to keep one step ahead. We answered the call even before these COVID times. We stepped up to the challenge, and thanks to your unwavering support, we've been able to send funds to Israel where it is needed the most. Now more than ever, in our 100th year, we need to stay connected. We need to put our heads together and draw on our collective wisdom, passion and vision to ensure the sustainability of this great movement and WIZO's position as Israel's leading social agent. I would now like to introduce our board member, Esther Wakeman, who will continue. Thank you, Esther.
No, but I touched the trolley. I moved the trolley over.
Hi, Granny.
Oh.
Yeah.
It was wonderful, but I didn't see your face.
No, they mucked it up, Mum.
It's not letting me.
That was fantastic. It was really beautiful, but I'm sorry I never saw.
Guys, we can hear everyone in the background. Sorry, I've had to unmute everyone. I'm really sorry, Esther. Can you please start again? And can everyone please be quiet while Esther speaks? Thank you so much.
Doesn't help. It's not working very well, is it?
Okay, not quite sure why we can't hear Esther. Esther, apologies, we cannot hear you on your end.
Esther's still muted.
No, everyone's unmuted. Nobody's muted.
Yes, she is.
Shall I begin?
Yes, thanks, Esther.
Okay, third time lucky.
Third time lucky.
Robert Goot AOSC, who will be our interviewer tonight, really needs no introduction within this community. However, he does deserve one. And due to time limits and the length of his very imposing CV, I will try to do it justice. A practicing barrister and senior counsel, he has held a large number of top leadership positions in the Jewish community over the last 40 years, which include chairman of the Australian Campaign for the Rescue of Soviet Jewry in the 70s, the youngest ever president of the Jewish Board of Deputies at the age of 30, president of Moriah College, during which time he meticulously managed the building of the Queen's Park campus, president of the Sydney Jewish Museum, and president of the ECAJ twice. His current positions widen into the international arena as the director of the Claims Conference Against Germany and as vice president of the World Jewish Congress. For his dedicated work, he has received many awards, including an AM in 1988 and more recently an AO this year in the Australia Day Honours List. Robert is definitely a community asset with his knowledge and commitment to us and the broader community. And I will now hand over to him to introduce our guest, Dave Sharma, MP. Thank you, Robert.
Thank you, Esther, and welcome everybody. Welcome, Dave. I hope you can hear me. I'm not worried if you can't see me. You should be grateful. But I wanted to say that almost a year ago, on the 24th of July, I was privileged to sit in the gallery of the House of Representatives to hear Dave Sharma deliver his maiden speech. They still call it maiden speech, but be that as it may. In that speech, he described himself in the following way: my story and all the other stories out there like it would, I'm quite certain, only be possible in Australia. In my own case, to go from being an immigrant to Australia of Indian background to an ambassador for Australia and now a member of our federal parliament within one generation. That's the short version. In fact, Dave was born in Canada of an Indian father and an Australian mother who met in London. And there's a bit of diversity for you. Tragically, Dave's mother died when he was 12, but he finished high school with the assistance, obviously, of his father and close relatives, and studied at Cambridge. As Prime Minister, and then he was appointed Australia's ambassador to Israel, where he served for 4 years. I don't think I'd be contradicted in saying he was universally regarded as one of the best ever Australian ambassadors to Israel. And indeed, I had the great pleasure and privilege of working with him in that capacity. He said of that experience in his maiden speech, that role left me with a high degree of admiration and respect for the state of Israel, the Jewish people, and all they have achieved under tremendously trying circumstances. It also gave me a deep affection for the Australian Jewish community, which has made an outsized years of Australian life and to the nation we are today. Dave, I believe that the Jewish community very warmly reciprocates that sentiment of deep affection. And I'm happy to welcome you here tonight on behalf of WIZO. Is it possible for the controllers to mute everyone except myself and Dave so that we don't have to have any extraneous noises? Dave, before I get into the interview proper, I think it's appropriate at the outset to acknowledge the recent announcement by the Honourable Jason Wood, Assistant Minister for Multicultural. I don't know what you missed, but
I think you started to mention Jason Wood's announcement, I think.
Okay, right. Well, just thank you, Dave. I was acknowledging the announcement by Jason Wood, the Assistant Minister for Multicultural Affairs, in which he announced in the last couple of days the round 5 of Safer Communities funding for communal infrastructure, including $5 million for 9 institutions, Jewish institutions in the eastern suburbs of Sydney. Now that's very significant and we're truly grateful. There is more funding for Jewish institutions that are not in the eastern suburbs of Sydney, and there are some, surprise, surprise. But Dave, can you convey, please, on our behalf to the government, our deep appreciation for that funding and the recognition that it represents of our significant security needs?
Of course, absolutely, Robert.
Right. Now, can I turn firstly to pick your brains, as it were, in relation to your 20 years experience in foreign diplomacy on behalf of Australia, You're regarded as a maven in foreign affairs, quite correctly. And there is one particular topic that exercises the minds of the Jewish community throughout the world, and that's annexation. By which I mean not annexation, because that's the wrong description, but a change in status or the extension of sovereignty by Israel in some or all of the West Bank. Last week, your colleague Maurice Payne, the Foreign Minister, issued a statement on the proposed extension of sovereignty by Israel to parts of Judea and Samaria, which for convenience I'll refer to as the West Bank, in which she said, she urged all parties to refrain from actions that diminish the prospects for a negotiated two-state solution, including acts of violence and terrorism, including rocket attacks on civilians. And she went on to say, and land appropriations, demolitions, and settlement activity. She said she was following with concern possible moves towards unilateral annexation or change in status of territory on the West Bank, and emphasised that the focus needs to be on a return to direct and genuine negotiations between Israel and Palestinians for a durable and resilient peace arrangement as soon as possible. Now, that was strong language for the minister used, possibly unprecedented for a coalition, Australian coalition government. How seriously, Dave, does the government view the effect of annexation on the peace process?
Well, thank you, Robert. Thank you for starting with such an easy question too. I really appreciate it. Before I get into it, I did want to say thank you, Robert, for the warm welcome. Thank you to WIZO for having me here this evening, but thank you more importantly for all the work you've done in Australia and Israel to strengthen the state of Israel, strengthen the communal ties between our two countries, and indeed strengthen Australia. And I'm conscious it is your 100-year anniversary this week, in fact, as you said, this year. And it's a shame we can't commemorate it right now with the significance it deserves. But I had a very small certificate of appreciation here, which I did want to present to you in person at the right occasion. And I'm sure there'll be an opportunity in the not too distant future when we can find an occasion that is befitting to mark the significance of all you've achieved. So thank you for having me here tonight. And I thank you again on behalf of all the elected representatives in Australia of all the work you've done.
Thank you.
Now on annexation or the application of Israeli sovereignty to part of the West Bank or Judea and Samaria, to which it hasn't yet been applied. Look, I've obviously seen this has been spoken of for many years. It usually comes up in an election campaign. So my initial reaction when this first started to be aired as a proposal was, look, it's tied up in domestic politics. In Israel, it's designed to appeal to a certain group of voters, but usually what has happened in the past with these sorts of decisions is that they've tended to have been walked back over time. And look, that may well indeed be the fate of this. There was a 1 July deadline, if you like, for this to happen. But I think this has gone on a lot further than I thought it might. I think most people in the international community, and I think Australia recognises, and at least I certainly recognise, that the 67 borders, if you like, are not defensible borders. And whilst they should be the starting point for negotiations, I don't think anyone in the international community expects them to be the end point of negotiations. So I think there's a recognition that Israel's legitimate security needs and concerns, and its history, of course, will require some adjustments to that border, and also, of course, the demographic reality of some of the major settlement blocks.
Everyone doesn't let you do it over Zoom.
I think there's a recognition there that there will be adjustments that need to be made to those borders. I think where this becomes difficult for us and for me and for the Australian government, though, is when these sorts of things happen outside the context of negotiating or moving towards an end state. Now, Israel's professed policy goal remains two nations for two peoples. It remains a two-state solution. There's only no one of any significance in the Israeli government or who has serious leadership aspirations talks of an entire Israel west of the Jordan River, annexing the entirety of Judea, Samaria, and even Gaza, because there's not a desire on the part of Israel or its people to govern another people. So I think whilst that remains the professed policy position, and indeed it's our view that there needs to be two states for two peoples, and moves like this, which the other party, which potentially undermine the integrity of that position, are problematic. Now, we have to wait for a few things. Firstly, does this actually happen? I still think it's a sort of a 50-50 proposition. And then if it does happen, how much land are we talking about here? Is it just the territory around, say, places like Ma'ale Adumim, the major settlement blocks that are adjacent to Israel that everyone recognises in any future peace deal would remain part of Israel? Is it just those, a couple of, narrow blocks where the Israeli population east of the 67 lines is concentrated? Or is it something more far-reaching that includes places like the Jordan River Valley, Ariel, areas around Hebron, which would render a sort of a future Palestinian state almost unviable and non-contiguous? So I think it depends very much on what is done here. Robert is right to say that this is not an issue that Australia normally seeks to take a loud, or seeks to have a loud voice on. It's rare that we tend to comment on these sorts of issues because we recognise that there's a whole lot of things we don't understand. It's very difficult to take a position on one issue in isolation. But I think we are concerned about the direction of this. We're concerned about what does it mean for a future Palestinian state? Would it make such a Palestinian state viable or unviable? I know there's no negotiations going on right now, but I don't think this would make it any easier to return to those negotiations. I know some argue otherwise. And ultimately, how does it serve Israel's security interests in the future? And I think that's an important consideration here. Israeli law, by and large, applies to the citizens that live inside those, places east of the 67 lines. Certainly in, areas C and B of the West Bank, Israel is by and large the sovereign still, and they have freedom of movement and freedom of operation, certainly along the Jordan River Valley and things like that. So it's hard for me to see, looking at it through a security lens, how this move enhances Israeli security or how it enhances the quality of life of those 400,000 odd Israelis that live east of the 67 lines, and it's even less who live outside of East Jerusalem. So I think this is where we have some difficulties with it. We don't think it necessarily serves the interests of Israel. We don't think it serves the interests of peace, and we don't think it makes a resumption to negotiations, which I think ultimately still has to be the pathway here, more likely.
Thank you. But increasingly, we hear voices saying, look, there's an unremitting Palestinian rejection of Israel's national homeland, the Jewish people. They've failed to even meet with Israel since 2014. The two-state solution is a forlorn hope. It's just not going to happen. What do you say to those sorts of people, to those people?
Well, I understand and sympathise with that view. And, this is why I was a supporter of Australia recognising Jerusalem as the capital of Israel. And indeed, considering moving our embassy there, I'm still a supporter of that, because Jerusalem as an issue had been caught up in Palestinian rejectionism, because the Palestinians wouldn't negotiate an outcome. The status of Jerusalem remained undetermined or undecided. And so Israel wasn't able to enjoy the rights of any normal nation state and declare its own capital and have people visit and travel there. So, I don't think Israel as a state should be held back or held hostage, if you like, by Palestinian rejectionism. And I think the status of Jerusalem is an important part of that. I think I'd support broader recognition of Israel, including amongst the Arab world, because again, Israel shouldn't have to negotiate peace with a partner before it enjoys that formal recognition. It's a fact of life. but these sorts of moves, I don't think, contribute to sort of meaningful statehood in that sense. I mean, Israel still, as I said, doesn't claim all the land west of the Jordan River for itself. I don't think it seeks to. And so you have to ask, well, how does this move sort of aid the normalcy of Israel? I don't think Israel's interactions with the international community or its status within the international community are being held back by Palestinian obstructionism, other than their ability to make peace with the Arab world and the status of Jerusalem. Now, I think those are two things we should address. But territorial claims in an area where Israel has, historically exercised a high degree of restraint, since the '67 war, I think is unrelated to that, if you like.
Thank you. And do you have a view on whether, on what the prospects are that the Trump plan, the Vision for Peace, which seems to be a paradigm shift in the face of there being nothing else happening in the peace process, that plan will galvanize the PA, the Palestinian Authority, into action, getting them to sit down and talk to the Israelis?
Look, I don't think so. And I think the empirical evidence suggests not. I mean, I've been interested and intrigued, and in some instances supportive of what can only be described as quite a disruptive style of diplomacy by the Trump administration, including in places like North Korea and elsewhere. And I think in Israel there was a prospect it might have worked. I mean, the fact that Trump recognised Jerusalem as the capital, moved the embassy there quite quickly, and unveiled this peace plan, gave a sense, if you like, that time was no longer on the Palestinian side, and that has been a problematic element of their behaviour, if you like. They've sort of historically had this view that they can just wait out Israel and time was on their side, and I think this has shown that to be otherwise. But I think the problems there in terms of getting the Palestinians to return to the negotiating table are almost not ours to solve. They're beyond our capacity to solve. I think part of it is generational. I think bluntly we need a new generation of Palestinian political leadership that is less invested in the narrative of 1948 and is more invested in the narrative of the 2020s and 2030s and beyond. And that's a Palestinian political leadership that wants to coexist with Israel, isn't obsessed with historical wrongs, wants a future for their own people, but one that envisages peaceful coexistence with Israel. So I think part of that's Palestinian generational. And I think the other big part that could really change Palestinian behaviour here is the broader Arab world. And there are signs of that, but the only people that can really force the Palestinians to the negotiating table in a political sense are the big Arab states. It's Egypt, it's Jordan, it's the Saudis, it's the Emiratis. If they force the Palestinian leadership to negotiate, then the Palestinian public would accept it. But having the Americans or the Europeans or the Australians sort of force them to do it doesn't work for them politically. So I think some of these changes that need to come about are more internal to the Arab world and internal to the Palestinian body politic. And we should support them by all means, but I don't think we should overestimate our sort of capacity to influence it.
What effect, if any, would the annexation have on those Arab countries you referred to, Egypt, Jordan, the Emiratis, in terms of their willingness to continue to engage, and indeed their thawing, it appears, of their relationships with Israel?
Very bluntly, it makes it harder for them. I mean, their national interests argue for a closer cooperation with Israel, and these are their interests that are by and large concerned about Iranian expansion in the region and Iranian support for Iranian ambitions for a hegemonic role in the region, and a withdrawal of sort of the US presence and influence in the Middle East. So all those things are pushing those countries towards closer cooperation with Israel. What's holding them back, though, is the opinion on the street, public opinion, and a high degree of public support for the Palestinian cause amongst their countries still. And what this has done, bluntly speaking, is put an issue that was sort of very low in the public consciousness across the Arab world, which is the Palestinian national cause, and it's put it right up to the top again. And we've seen that, the reaction from King Abdullah in Jordan, the opinion piece by the Emirati ambassador to Washington that was on the front page of Yediot a week or two ago. All of these things make it harder for these countries, even if their interests dictate that they do this, to cooperate openly with Israel, and they put back that process, which ultimately is not in Israel's interests either.
Does it also have an effect on the new generation of Palestinian leadership you referred to, if there is such a generation? Does it have an effect on them?
I think it does. I mean, I hope it doesn't radicalise them. I don't think it. Again, it sort of depends upon the degree of annexation. If it's annexation of land that's already basically sort of under sovereign Israeli control, less so. But if it's things like the Jordan River Valley, the Ariel, Hebron, some of these further flung settlements, then if a future Palestinian generation doesn't see a prospect for a future Palestinian state, then you sort of have to wonder, well, what path will they turn to? And there are other risks, of course. I mean, the Palestinians always brandish this threat. Again, I'm a little skeptical about it, but an end to security cooperation with Israel, which is an important strategic asset for Israel. There's no doubting that. Now, the Palestinians have their own interest for wanting to preserve that, basically to stave off the radicals within their own camp and to keep an eye on Hamas and these other sort of more extreme factions in the West Bank. But if their situation becomes so politically hopeless that they have to look at extreme things, again, that would redound on Israel to its detriment, I think.
Okay, and the last annexation question is this. It's now the 7th of July, and nothing's happened. Is annexation going to go the way of the millennium bug? Why do you think nothing's happened?
Well, look, I think there's hesitation amongst the Israeli governing coalition about this. I mean, Benny Gantz is less than enthusiastic. I think Netanyahu knows the security risks of doing this and the risks to the relations with the Arab world. I don't think they've gotten quite the green light from the Trump administration that some might have anticipated. It's hard to know because that's not so much in the public domain. But I think the reaction there has probably been a little lukewarm. So I think this is, and I expect that the security establishment in Israel, that's the IDF, the Shabak, Kogat, all these arms that sort of deal with the Palestinian population on a daily basis, are arguing against it. So, look, lots of things in Israel are promised and not delivered. This might be one of them. Or it might be that what ends up happening is something that's quite minimalist, that ticks a box that probably irritates the international community, but doesn't fundamentally change the situation on the ground, or or undermine the prospects of a two-state solution. And I hope it's sort of, one of those two scenarios: either nothing happens, or it's a pretty minimalist annexation, which doesn't disrupt the fabric of the place.
Well, time will tell. Can I venture into another area of foreign policy, and that is, again, harkening back to your maiden speech, where you said there were 3 pillars that underpinned Australian security and guaranteed our freedom since our emergence as a modern nation. Firstly, our splendid isolation, which has given us a large measure of security. Secondly, we've enjoyed strategic alliances with the major naval powers of the day that have safeguarded our seas and trading routes. And thirdly, we've been the beneficiary of a world order which has guaranteed the rights of all nations, not just the powerful. Now, given the events, and that this was 12 months ago, given the events of the last 12 months, and particularly those of this year, how are those pillars holding up for Australia in your view?
I think very bluntly they are shakier. To go through each of them, our isolation no longer affords us the degree of security it once did, and because the things that can be done these days to undermine Australian sovereignty or security or prosperity can increasingly be done in the digital or the cyber realm. They can be done from afar. They can be done in a way that's doesn't involve a naval flotilla blockading our sea lanes, but it can involve interference in our media, interference in our institutions, cyber attacks on government entities, all these sorts of things. So I think the world is only seeing more and more of that, and we've seen. I mean, the Prime Minister made an announcement just the week before last with the Defence Minister about the unprecedented level of cyber intrusions we've been seeing in Australia. We saw a worrying incident of a New South Wales Labor MP whose office was raided by ASIO last week in connection with an investigation into foreign interference. So Australia is no longer kind of cut off from those trends of the world. I think the second pillar, our alliance with the major maritime power of the day, that still holds, but China definitely intends to and is increasingly challenging US supremacy, at least in East Asia and the Pacific, our part of the world. And, China is increasingly acquiring things like anti-ship ballistic missiles, electromagnetic weapons, things that could be used to do what they intend to do, which is sort of push out the United States Pacific Fleet beyond the first island chain, as they call it, and out to the second and the third island chain. And the announcements that the Prime Minister made last week about our defence expenditure, but also importantly our defence acquisitions, are a recognition of that. Some of the major things he announced we'd be acquiring were standoff missiles, land-based anti-ship ballistic missiles, and offensive cyber capabilities. They're basically designed to help protect our own sea lanes and lanes of approaches and deter someone from seeking to exploit those. Now, in the past, we could rely upon the supremacy of the US Navy to guarantee all of those things: freedom of navigation, freedom of commerce, freedom on the high seas. Increasingly, we're having to become more self-reliant. And then, look, the last pillar is sort of a benevolent international order where it's rules-based. Every nation is sovereign and has a degree of equality around that, and disputes are settled by reference to a well-known body of rules and jurisprudence and international arbitration, if need be. And increasingly, with China's behaviour, we're seeing them basically seek to arm wrestle with each of their adversaries and bully and intimidate them into backing down. And of course, look, Australia's the subject of this now because we sought to engage these international institutions to examine the origins and causes and the lessons that could be learnt from this COVID-19 outbreak. And China didn't like that and has sought to pressure us since by doing things like initiating an anti-dumping investigation into our barley, suspending our beef exports, advising Chinese tourists and students not to travel to Australia. They're doing this with other nations too. They're doing it with Canada. I mean, they just two Canadian nationals that they've held for 18 months, which were basically seized in response to the house arrest of a Huawei executive in Vancouver, Canada, have just been sentenced now, or sorry, announced they've been charged. So China's sort of seeking to use its might, if you like, its strength, to have its way in the world. And that's a worrying world for Australia, because ultimately, as a nation of 25 million people, we're not, and a decent sized economy, but still small by global standards. We can't, in a single arm wrestle against an adversary, we're not going to win. So this is why we've always believed in safety in numbers and a rules-based world. And again, that's under threat by China, because I think they would like to rewrite the rules. So there's a different order where their writ prevails by and large, and other nations sort of sort it out amongst themselves, but away from the top table.
Well, you were recently quoted in the, indeed you wrote an opinion piece in the Sydney Morning Herald saying that Australia and its Western allies needs to welcome Russia back into the world's most exclusive group of nations, the G7, to manage the rise of China, to in effect reshuffle the deck. Isn't that rewarding Russia for bad behaviour, for example, in Crimea and MH17?
I think it would be, but I think necessity demands it. I mean, in 1941, we found cause to cooperate with the Soviet Union, which I think had been an exemplar of bad behaviour up until that point. But we focused on the bigger challenge to the international order, the common enemy of Nazi Germany. And look, without Soviet participation in that war, without the war on the Eastern Front, we would not have prevailed in that conflict. That's the simple truth. In 1968, or from 1968 to 1972, Nixon, or the Nixon administration, Henry Kissinger, Richard Nixon, again decided to reach out to China to help balance an aggressive Soviet power. And again, China was not an exemplar of international behaviour. The Americans and China had fought a bloody war in Korea. The Chinese were supporting the North Vietnamese in the Vietnam conflict. This was not an easy thing to do. But I think it was Shimon Peres always had this saying, and I'm sure he used it many times, but he certainly said it to me in a different context. But you don't make peace with your friends, you make peace with your enemies. The whole idea of peace is it's difficult because you're doing things with people with whom you have grievances, often long-standing. But I think fundamentally, China is a bigger threat to the international order today than Russia is. Russia is a sort of a country that plays a weak hand very well. They have significant attributes that make them a sort of a world power. They have a seat on the UN Security Council. They have intercontinental ballistic missiles with nuclear weapons payloads. They've got significant armed forces. They've got a significant intelligence service. But fundamentally, they're a country, 140 million, an economy about the size of Australia's, demographic challenges, long land border with China, thinly populated Far Eastern region. Their prospects are not great. And I think they would feel as threatened by China's rise and aggression as parts of the West. And I think for that reason, there's a deal to be done there. Of course, doesn't mean that Russian behaviour could continue as it has. Part of the deal would have to be that they would no longer behave in the way that they've done. But a part of the deal for us would be that we'd have to accept the legitimacy of some of their claims or respect what they see as their sort of core sovereign interests, including in their sort of periphery in Europe. And I know that's a hard thing to stomach, but that's sort of the real politic of it.
It may be, but if a deal were to be done, would that not involve in your words, a bold act of statecraft? And is the US administration capable of that bold act of statecraft?
Not this administration. And I say that mainly because Trump is too compromised on Russia, rightly or wrongly. The reason that Nixon could go to China was because he had this reputation as a hawk and a fervent anti-communist. Trump is already seen as sort of too soft on Russia, too cozy with Putin. There's an unusual relationship, and people would, he wouldn't have the political support because I think people would suspect his motives and doubt his credentials. So it doesn't mean it has to be a Biden administration. I just think Trump personally would not be able to pull this off, but certainly a future US administration could, I think.
Okay. And if I can turn lastly to local politics, Eden Monero, the Liberal Party came within a whisker of winning the seat, Mike Kelly's old seat, and the ALP suffered a swing against it. What can we learn from that result? And do the Nationals and John Barilano in particular have some explaining to do?
Look, I think I'd say at the start, by-elections are always sort of curious products of their unique circumstances, and everyone likes to try and extrapolate broader lessons from it, but it's often best to just realise that there are peculiarities in play. I know this, having gone through a by-election which was quite torrid and we lost. Labor had a 2% swing against it. I had like an 18 or 22% swing against me or the Liberal Party in my by-election. But 7 months later, the result was basically reversed. I think in Eden Monero, you had a lot of minor parties running, which they tend to do in a by-election, less likely in a general because it gives them a platform. So you had you know, you had the Hemp Party, which took up about sort of 1.5 to 2% of the vote. You had, I think, 14 candidates altogether. Shooters Party, Fred Nile Party, a party called the New Liberals, all these sorts of parties running, which basically drag away from the primary votes of the major parties. And they usually get redistributed against the sort of the incumbent government in Canberra, which of course is our government. So I think, I mean, the things that hurt us were the shooters, farmers and fishers, and the fact that, you know, they took about 6% of the vote. You know, about 4% of that went to the ALP, which certainly helped get them over the line. The Nationals did not poll well. I mean, they sort of were about 3% down on their primary vote, which I think is a reflection of their own infighting and distractions. But again, that detracted from our result. I haven't seen how the Nationals' preferences were actually distributed, but there was a lot of sort of dog whistling that was going on there. And I don't think there's any doubt in my mind that, you know, given we're on a Chatham House call, that John Barilaro's interventions were not helpful. I mean, they were sort of a distraction to the campaign that had to be run, and they gave a picture of kind of, you know, internal incoherence and division, and the Nationals voters weren't quite sure where to go or where to turn. So I think, look, for all those reasons, I think, you know, we came close to winning it, but we didn't. It would have been unusual if we did. I don't think a government has won a by-election of a seat held by the opposition in 100 years. So it would have been history making if we'd done so. But I would think that at a general election, depending on how we're travelling more broadly in the government, that seat is certainly winnable. So I don't think it'll have an enduring impact, and it's, you know, the curious product of its own eccentricities, I'd say.
Thank you. Okay, Di, that's it from me. I think you've got a couple of questions on chat.
Yes, thanks so much, David and Robert. Ian Groden has asked, how can the Palestinians come to the negotiating table when they can't speak with one voice?
I think that's a very legitimate point. I mean, and it's been the problem now for, I don't know, 15 years, right, since Hamas took over in Gaza. I think it is a problem. I mean, Israel can negotiate with the Palestinians over Judea and Samaria, or the West Bank, but it's a completely different negotiation with a different set of actors with Gaza. There've been, you know, multiple attempts to form a Palestinian government of national unity or some sort of unified government over many years, several when I was there. They always fall apart quite quickly. So look, I accept that's a problem. And again, I'd say I think it's part of the sort of Palestinian generational leadership change that needs to happen. I mean, Abbas cannot bring Hamas back into the fold. I hope there's a future Palestinian political leader, I don't know who that is, who is strong enough to bring the Palestinian public with him or her, is strong enough to bring Hamas back into the tent, and is pragmatic enough to be able to negotiate with Israel over things the Palestinians have previously not been able to negotiate. But that's sort of it's a question for sort of internal Palestinian political dynamics, but that has to change. I agree with you.
Thanks, Dave. And Ronnie Bogner's asking, in all of Israel's achievements and challenges, why do you think we cannot get balanced international reporting? This is the this is the question that everyone asks us all the time.
Look, I'm an optimist there. I mean, I accept the premise that the international reporting on Israel is not balanced. It tends to be very narrowly focused on elements of Israel, largely the Israel-Palestinian conflict and things like that. And it tends to be a little, you know, have a particular narrative structure that it follows, which is, you know, Israel the aggressor, the Palestinians the victims, or the Arab world the victims, and Israel as a sort of a lawless state. I mean, I accept all that's true, but I would say that I think the sort of media and public fascination with that narrative is diminishing over time. I think we see less of it. Increasingly, you see Israel in the news for other reasons, which is a good thing. It might be Israel as the startup nation, or what Israel's doing with water, or Israeli cybersecurity experts, or Israel tech. Sometimes it's Israel cooking. You know, it's like, you know, Yotam Ottolenghi in his cookbooks, or, you know, Sami Tamimi. Sometimes it's nice stories of you know, coexistence. Sometimes it's Israeli drama like Fauda. I think those are all good things. I think increasingly people are realizing that Israel is not just a country full of kibbutzes at war with its neighbours, the media perception is moving on. And I think the sort of public appetite for those stories, I think, is diminishing. I mean, you see fewer journalists now in the Middle East that have a Jerusalem byline. It used to be that, I mean, Jerusalem used to have the most foreign correspondents anywhere in the world, outside of, you know, Washington or New York. I don't think that's the case anymore. A lot of people who cover the Middle East now are covering things like the conflict in Syria, Yemen, what's happening in Lebanon. And I think people, as a result, even if the reporting about Israel isn't changing so much, I think people are getting a more balanced picture of the Middle East, that, gee, that place is a real mess. There's a lot of bad stuff going on. There's a very few countries that are cohesive, never mind successful, and Israel is one of the few that is. And I think over time people start to think, well, you know, in a pretty despairing sort of a regional picture, Israel is a bright spot, and Israel is a constructive actor on the world stage, and Israel is bringing ideas and technology and innovation to these things. So I think that's changing slightly. I mean, we've all got to do what we can to encourage it. And, you know, certainly when I was ambassador in Israel, I did all I could to sort of promote some of these other sides of Israel. And we don't need to do it in a tendentious or kind of overly Hasbara sort of a way. It doesn't always have to be that. Often it's about not necessarily engaging on the terrain that, you know, the people who want to paint Israel as the villain are. So you could spend, you know, hours and hours arguing with people who think the Palestinians are right and the Israelis are wrong about why the Israelis are right and the Palestinians are wrong. But sometimes you just need to sort of change the channel or talk about or change the terrain of the debate. And I think that's important to remember, that people need to be, and we all need to be, telling stories about Israel that aren't just sort of conflict or dispute related. They need to be all this other stuff, the quirky stuff, the funny stuff, the arts and culture, the stuff that all of us in our societies can relate to quite well. And I think Israel's doing a better job of that in sort of showing the other sides to itself, because it's like any country, it's a multifaceted nation with, you know, with good attributes and attributes that need fixing, and honest reflections upon itself and its own character. And I think people can relate to a nation like that, because our nation's like that. Australia's like that. Canada's like that. The UK's like that. France is like that. And the more we can sort of encourage that sort of a conversation about Israel, I think the less traction, if you like, the kind of the Israel as the villain, Palestinians as the victim narrative gets hold or gets traction.
Can I just ask a supplementary on that, Dave? Palestinian victimhood has been given a good kick along, if I can use that expression, in the Black Lives Matter movement,
as
demonstrations, but the movement, and on social media as opposed to mainstream media. How serious do you see that as a challenge?
I see that as a very serious challenge. I mean, I think this is sort of part of this kind of the new anti-Semitism, if you like. It's the anti-Semitism of what we sort of consider to be the political left, where, you know, people who think of themselves as progressive and worldly and enlightened and, you know, against racism and against discrimination, bundle together a whole lot of causes, some of which are, you know, legitimate, some of, you know, police violence against blacks in America, or high rates of Indigenous incarceration in Australia, or, you know, the Me Too movement, you know, discrimination against females in the workplace, all perfectly legitimate causes, but increasingly get people bundling all these things up together, and then they throw in sort of an anti-Israel or a Palestinian thing in there. So they're supporting First Nations people in Australia, Palestinians in Israel, you know, blacks in America, and they're all quite separate issues, of course, with separate causes and separate things to address. But the left, I think, likes to sort of put all these together and put it around a single framework of oppression or colonialism or white privilege or whatever it might be, or the patriarchy, or, you know, any of that. They put it all under together and they try and create one single villain that's kind of responsible for all of this. And Israel is being, unfortunately, pushed into this category by people. People who would have no other view on any other international issue under the sun. You know, they wouldn't have a view on, you know, should Syria be run by Assad? You know, should you know, the enclave in Idlib be overrun by Turks or not? You know, are the Russians good guys or bad guys? What's the proper status of Crimea? You know, does Nagorno-Karabakh belong to Armenia or Azerbaijan? You know, should Sinn Féin sit in the Northern Irish government? Any of those sorts of things, not a view at all, not part of their worldview. But on this issue, they have a view. They'll wave I mean, you know, you saw this Palestinian flags waving at all these rallies that was engineered by Black Lives Matter. This has got nothing to do with that issue. I mean, it's a complete red herring, but they like to sort of bundle all this up together. And so progressives of a certain ilk these days, and particularly pronounced in Europe, I think it's increasingly pronounced in the United States, and that worries me. They wear they wave the Palestinian flag. They support the Palestinian cause, not on its merits, but sort of as an identifier, you know, as a all good progressives must do this. And I think that's leading to a lot of anti-Semitism, and it's leading to anti-Semitism that's not from where the traditional quarters. It's not from the sort of white nationalist, ethno-nationalist parts of Europe that's always had that sort of anti-Semitism to it, and which still exists. It's kind of this new source, and that does worry me. It has some support in Australia here too. I think much less than in Europe, less than in the United States, but it worries me.
Yeah, it's a huge worry.
It's a huge
Over to you, Di. Sorry.
Thanks, Robert. A question from Vera Goldberg. How do you feel about an Indigenous voice?
I support an Indigenous voice. I mean, you know, I support the Uluru Statement from the heart. I don't have the expertise in these issues to have a desire to be prescriptive about what form that voice should take. You know, whether the idea of a voice should be constitutionally enshrined, but the mechanism of the voice or the attributes of the voice should be put in legislation. I'm relatively agnostic about those sorts of things, but I think it's a part of unfinished business, if you like, in Australia, or an imperfection that we need to address, that Indigenous people in Australia do not participate fully in the life of the nation. They don't participate fully in the political life of the nation, but they also don't participate fully in the economic and public life of the nation. They probably do in the cultural life of the nation, but generally speaking, they're underrepresented or disadvantaged in all these areas. And I think the voices and the Uluru Statement from the heart is not a solution to all of those issues, but it's certainly a solution to one of political representation and acknowledgement of their sovereignty over Australia, their early sovereignty over Australia, and their continued sovereignty over parts of Australia as well. And I think it's an important part of sort of coming to terms with that history. So I would like to see it enacted. As I said, it's going through a process now of consultation, the sort of what form the voice takes. I don't know whether we'll have a referendum on it in this term of Parliament. That was the initial promise. I would still like to see that happen. But I'd like to see it happen at a time when it has the highest chance of success, because I think it's incredibly important if we put this to a referendum, whatever the mechanism is, we need to make sure it succeeds, because if it doesn't, if it's voted down in a referendum, then I think it would set back that cause, a couple of decades at least. So I'm a sort of a pragmatist and a realist on this. I'd rather, do something that's 70% optimal and succeeds than is, 90% optimal and that fails. Yeah. But I do want to see it addressed.
Oh, excellent. And a question from Yvonne Coburn. What is your position on conducting secret trials, such as those currently being prosecuted in Australia against David McBride and Bernard Collery?
Well, my position is, in an ideal world, there would be no secret trials in Australia. My preference would always be to have these things argued in open court with the media covering and with the public able to make up their own minds. But I accept, and I know not everyone does, people have a different view on this issue. I accept that there are certain instances where the national security considerations are such, and that's normally a disclosure of operations or methods or techniques, are such that that sort of broader public interest, if you like, or that principle has to give way to, a restricted trial behind closed doors. There's still independent legal counsel, there's still a judge, there's still a rule of law, and there's still an independent judiciary. But it's right, there's not the same public scrutiny of it. Look, Australia is obviously not unique in this. I mean, Israel has to do this all the time for various matters. Any country bluntly speaking, that runs an intelligence service, and we do, and does covert operations, and we do. I mean, that's no news. You have to have concern about these sorts of things. There's certain things that you can't reveal or disclose in public because it would compromise your national sovereignty in other ways. So I don't know the particulars of the case beyond what I've read in the media. I accept, though, that there are national security considerations. Ultimately, I mean, the government doesn't dictate that the trial should be closed. The counsel for the government argues that it is, but it's ultimately for the judge to decide whether he accepts that argument or not, he or she accepts that argument or not. The judge has ruled on that. I accept the legitimacy of that ruling.
Thanks, Dave. And a question from Gloria Newhouse. Do you think that Trump will win the upcoming election? And is this a good thing for world order? And can he handle the Chinese aggression?
This is an incredibly difficult question for Diplomat, because the first training in a diplomat is you certainly never comment on another country's elections and which candidate you want to support. You tend to try and avoid commenting on their politics. But so I'll give you an
politician now, not a diplomat.
No, that's true. That's true. But I'll give you an analytical view rather than my personal view. I think as things currently stand, Biden is the favourite to win the presidency. I'd say I'd put Trump's chances as sort of somewhere between 20 to 25% at the moment. That doesn't mean Biden will win. I think most of the sort of good analysis before the 2016 elections had Trump as about a 1 in 3 chance of winning the presidency. But a 1 in 3 chance is not an insignificant one. You'd take a bet on a 1 in 3 chance if your odds were high enough. And, you know, Trump won the presidency despite losing, losing the majority, not having the majority of votes. He sort of built a coalition amongst a few key states. Now, I think, so Trump's pathway to victory in 2016 was narrow, and he hasn't broadened his appeal since that time. I don't think any polling suggests he has. So he has to sort of tread the same narrow pathway to victory. Now, what's he got going against him this time that wasn't for him last time? Well, to be honest, Joe Biden is a much less polarizing figure than Hillary Clinton. People, you know, I think for a lot of wrong reasons, but they hated Hillary Clinton. They felt passionately about her. People just don't feel that way about Joe Biden. He's avuncular. He's just this nice old guy. People find it hard to take offense at him or take a strong dislike to him. So Trump can't rely upon mobilizing people. And you can see the way he's campaigning against Biden, he's having a very hard time to try and sort of box Biden in or attach an epithet to him or find a way to sort of focus people's dislike on him. Biden's got strong appeal in the people that Trump needs to build a coalition, and that's white, working class, non-college educated. You know, Biden grew up in Scranton, Pennsylvania. He's got strong appeal in those sort of Rust Belt states like Michigan, like Pennsylvania, like Ohio, like Wisconsin, where Trump built a coalition last time. And he still sort of holds together the rest of the Democratic coalition, you know, progressives, college educated, blacks, you know, the East Coast and West Coast states and all those sorts of things. So I find it hard at the moment. I can't see states this time that Trump can win that he didn't win last time. And I see a lot of states that are vulnerable that he held last time. So I think Biden's more likely to win. I think, look, I think it would be good for the world for a Biden presidency. I think, you know, I can't say that a Trump presidency has been wholly bad or wholly good. I think it's probably been more bad than good, though. And I think we could do with a bit more predictability in the US administration and its decision-making, less concentration of power. The things I worry about most with Trump are not so much what he does abroad, but it's his treatment and attitude towards institutions in the United States, to things like the courts and the judiciary, to things like the press, to officers like the Attorney General and district prosecutors and things like that. I mean, the United States is a country built on checks and balances and the separation of powers, just as Australia is. But Trump, his tendency, his natural inclination is to rule more like an autocrat and not as as the leader of a co-equal branch of government. And I find that troubling. I think it's bad for America ultimately. And I think a second term of that, I think the institutions in America have held up quite strongly, but I think a second term of that would not only weaken those institutions, but they create a new template for political success, which others would be inclined to follow, which would sort of lead us down this kind of populist strongman model of government, which I don't like. I don't think it's good for the United States, and I'd hate to see it sort of take off here.
Thanks so much, Dave. That's it with the questions. There was a statement from, I'm not sure who iPad 3 is, that everyone can read, but I would now like to hand over to Benita, please. Benita?
Hi.
Vice President Benita Camp, thank you.
Rob and Dave, on behalf of all of our Zoomers this evening, what a fantastic hour. Thank you. We appreciate that both of you took the time out of your busy schedules to be with us, to be with WIZO, to cover these topics, which we all find so relevant today. How fortunate we are to have you as the WIZO Council in our very own community. And we really do look forward to many more years of working together. And now we want to run the anthems through again so that we can all actually hear Amber singing them. So if you would all just bear with us, that would be wonderful.
Australians, all let us rejoice, for we are young and free. We've golden soil and wealth, for toil our home is girt by sea. Our land abounds in nature's gifts, our beauty rich and rare. In history's page let every stage advance Australia fair. In joyful strains then let us sing, advance Australia fair. Color paleva penima nefesh Yehudi homiha ulvar demizrach kadima. Let's see home, Sophia.
So beautiful, Amber. Thank you again. Just wanted to finish by saying another huge thank you to Robert and Dave. I would like to call you our WIZO Menschers. You really are both incredible men. Thank you both so much. Dave, especially for your friendship and love of WIZO all these years. Robert, yours is, been incredible over the years as well. So just wanted to thank everyone for Zooming in tonight. I know it's really, really cold out there and it was just such an amazing evening, and stay safe everyone, and look forward to seeing you all soon. Good night. Laila Tov.
Laila Tov.
Laila Tov. And aren't we lucky to have Dave Sharma as the member for Wentworth?
Yes.
Brilliant.
Just remember to vote me back in.
Unmuting everyone so everyone can speak and say good night.
Good night. It was a
Thank you.
Wonderful.
Thank you. That was wonderful.
Good night, everybody.
Good night.
Bye. Thank you very much.
Robert. Thank you, Dave.
Bye, Vera. See you, everyone.
See you all.
Bye, Els. Bye,
Wonderful.
Barry.
Bye, 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 bye.
Thank you
Darabah.
very much.
Good night, Dave. Thank you.
Bye. Thank you. You're amazing.
Thanks, everyone.
You got to use. Try and do it with your finger. Not an iPhone.
Yeah. Yeah.